morning, everyone. Put your hand up if you've heard of a TV show called Game of Thrones. Keep your hand up if you love Game of Thrones. Okay, good. Now, the reason I've put up this organisation chart is to show what I think is complexity at its most baffling. When I think of some of the names of characters in this show, Lady Brienne of Tarth, Sir Stannis Baratheon, Princess Khaleesi, my favourite. These are complex names, and I'm often referring to this chart as I watch the show to remind myself the names that people have, because it's difficult. But my point is that it's background information. It's not something you need to know perfectly well in order to derive pleasure from the show. And so if we bring it to the realm and context of investments, I think of so often what happens with investment committees is that a proposition is put before them for analysis, debate and deliberation. I had a similar experience, or a comparable experience, in my personal life when I recently had to buy a home PC. Now, I'm technologically inexpert in this regard, and so I found myself asking questions of the salesperson and getting answers I really didn't understand. And that was because, as I'll show in the next slide, I didn't have a framework to comprehend the information. I'm aware that there are things called RAM and ROM and screen size and which version of Windows you have, but I can't fit them together in a way that allows me to make a rational, coherent decision. And guess what the outcome was? I was sold a PC rather than I bought a PC. And when you're sold something, you end up with a level of disappointment. And so in our life, let's take a concrete example. Suppose you'll have a proposition put before you at your investment committee about the relative weightings of emerging market equities and developed market equities. Now, there's a lot of things you have to think about there. You have to think about the different shape and feel and contour of the economies in emerging markets versus development markets. You need to know something about the interest rate structure, the currency, the capitalisation of the stock markets. I think even lower down, you need to have a belief that growth of GDP is somehow synchronised with growth in stock markets, which, by the way, is a thesis that some people contest. And I would say, in the form in which I've placed it before you, it's a very inexact kind of thing to say, because you're not talking about any measurement period that could be tested in practice. So it seems to me that having a framework to make decisions is what it's all about. And we are all experts. I think it's important to say we're all experts in something or many things. And my contention is that you don't need to be an expert in investments in order to make quality decisions. And to bolster this, I read about a psychological experiment. Psychologists are very clever people. They tend to do their experiments on college students in America who seem to have a lot of time to spend on surveys. And a very nice little test is to take American college students who are typically ignorant about matters outside their own country and give them pairs of cities in Germany, of all places, and ask which city has the larger population. Now, that turns out to be quite a complex question, because what you can do is set up the model so that you have people who are clearly ignorant, and therefore for them, if you ask, does Berlin have a bigger population than Darmstadt, they'll just randomly get the right or wrong answer. You can have inexpert people, you can have incredibly well credentialed people who claim to know a lot about German geography, but you can have people in the middle who know something. And it turns out that when you perform this experiment, it's the people in the middle who know something, more than nothing, but are less than experts, who turn out to make better inferences. They make better inferences than the so-called experts. And that's because cities are things you might know something about, but the population of a city is not a statistic you tend to keep in your head. And I was given some expert help here this morning at breakfast. You may have noticed that our chef who cooks the omelettes is called Ewout Jeske. He happens to be German. And I asked him to name a mid-sized German city, and he dutifully obliged, Würzburg, and a small German city, he dutifully obliged, Wertheim. So when you're given a whole list of pairs of German cities and asked which has the bigger population, that's actually quite a daunting question for an expert. But the reason the mid-ranking half novice, half expert gets it right more often than not is that when you know something, when you've heard of a city, then you tend to think it has a bigger population, and that is what psychologists call the representative heuristic. So in other words, you have an intuition about something that is not based on your knowledge, but your intuition guides you to correct answers and correct outcomes more often than not. And so I ask myself, who are the kinds of people in the broader community beyond our investment community who are good or bad at making decisions? And it turns out, as I read in the literature, that livestock judges are very good. I'm sure there's people in this room who know a lot about livestock. Psychiatrists are hopeless. And the reason you have this opposition is that the livestock judges or the soil analysts, they're dealing with things that are relatively stable, where they can gather knowledge and the knowledge is going to be applicable day in, day out. Whereas psychiatrists and investment people are dealing with a world that changes. I've been in the investment markets for over 30 years and I've never seen the same day twice. It's always different. And so what I'd like to say is that when we scratch around for analogies, and often people when they talk about our industry talk about horse racing and casinos, I put forward the modest proposition that we should excise those terms from our vocabulary. I think it's bad, and I think if people outside this room heard us talk like that, they wouldn't be very happy with us. I think the model of people who are able to make scientific predictions and do so with a reasonable level of self-confidence and dignity are, of all people, weather forecasters. And weather forecasters have learned something very clever in the last 10 years. They've learnt not to say it'll rain tomorrow, because that could be falsified and then they look like complete gooses. They say there is a 60% probability of rain tomorrow. Then they're never going to be called to account because no one's going to run the large-scale test of every prediction they ever make and put it into a nice bell curve. And to me, that's the way we should talk at our investment committees. Our investment committees should be based on a discussion around likely outcomes, which of course back an investment thesis that has what we like to say in lingo an asymmetric risk and gives us more upside than downside, but we should think in the domain of probability, as Roger Irwin and Gordon Clark have been telling us to do for years. And so let me finish with one slide, and this is slightly depressing. Let's not forget that we are also humans, we have emotions, and when we make decisions, we have this bias called regret. Regret is the outcome that was a bad outcome that came about because you made a conscious decision. So, you know, you're driving your car home from work and you decide to experiment and go east rather than west for the first kilometre and have a car accident. You will then suffer regret that you made that foolish choice to take a different drive route home from work. Regret is, I think, pervasive in our industry, but we never talk about it. Regret, I think, is what can lead to the next decision being suboptimal, because it's the once bitten, twice shy. You suffer regret, you start to think, oh dear, that's probably a little bit bold, I'll do something more defensive, and as a result you might end up with an inferior outcome for your members. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I might now just call for any questions or comments on John's icebreaker. The Q&A line feed is now open, and the information is up there on your screens if you'd like to text or tweet a question in. But can I see if there's anybody who'd like to comment or ask John a question on what he's presented before we kick on? Or are there any comments from our panel? If not, we might just head into the Q&A. I think we'd probably all agree that good decision making is a product of skills and knowledge and interest, sufficient information, good processes, adequate time. So if we can perhaps start on some of those, I'd be quite interested if we could talk about some of the processes and the different ways in which investment committees are structured in the different funds. I might ask you, Danielle, first, if you wouldn't mind talking about your structure and how it's changed recently and why.
Sure. We have a subset of the board on the investment committee plus 2 independent advisors. Historically, the CIO and the CEO were on the investment committee. Why has that changed? The main reason that's changed is that we think the investment committee is really about governance, and it's about making sure that the structure, the delegations, the authority and the accountability is there. Now, if myself and my CIO sit on the board that's governing myself, I'm not sure that that quite works. Right? There's a little bit of a challenge there. So it's very hard to say no to yourself. If you are having that argument in your head, maybe you should go and have it outside as opposed to in the investment committee. So we felt that it was better governance to take it off. I tend to agree with, or I do agree with John when he said you don't have to be an investment expert to be on an investment committee, although I think you do have to have a basic understanding of the instruments we're using, the things we're trying to achieve. And I think the trade-off for not having experts on the committee is that you've got to have a good governance structure. And so the work has to be put into that governance structure, the delegations, the reporting and the accountability.
And the experts, Danielle, that you have that advise the committee, they're not members of the committee, are they? No,
they're not formally. We do have the ability to have them as formal members of the committee if we want them. Do we have any regulators in the room? No, good. I can say this with impunity. The reason we took them off the committee was simply that it made the whole responsible officer structure far too difficult, and we felt that it was better to have them as advisors on the committee as opposed to trying to wrap them up into that crazy reporting standards and requirements.
That's interesting. So you mentioned the kinds of backgrounds that you look for members of the committee. John, I know you've got some views about not only people's skills and knowledge, but about the things that drive them. Would you care to comment on what you think you should look for in members?
As an ideal member of an investment committee, I think someone with a sense of curiosity, someone with a passion for investments. And I think also we shouldn't think of them as individuals, but as a cohesive whole. And if it's okay with you, let me go back a couple of slides to when I referred to the framework that I lacked when I made a decision about buying a PC, and now bitterly regret that I don't have that framework. I think a well-run committee would have a common framework for thinking through investment issues, one that perhaps is forged over months or years of discussion, but nonetheless gives them a common intellectual framework for thinking through the propositions put before them.
So is that one of the things that would come out of your comments this morning if we had to kind of pick one or two or three things that investment committee should do?
Yes.
Is that one of them?
Yeah, it would. And maybe they could go off-site with at least one psychologist and talk through all of these issues and find out more about themselves as individuals and as a group as a result.
I might turn now to Robyn, whose investment committee I think is a committee of the whole, and some might actually say that's not a committee at all. Would you like to comment about that?
Yeah, look, our board made some decisions, and they review the committee membership once a year, and late last year they decided that they would bring the investment committee into the board structure. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One was that we have got a fairly engaged board. It is not something that we have a problem with in getting board members to meetings and so forth. And we also have a good board arrangement where the skills and the knowledge within that board actually do complement each other. We also know, and the board are also facing a situation where succession planning is a key part of this whole process, and it's not necessarily about the board as a whole, it's about each of your subcommittees as well. And they also recognise that managing the investments within superannuation is probably one of the biggest fiduciary obligations that they do have, and they therefore see that as an important part of their role as a board member to make sure that they understand and are involved in the investment side of things. So that's basically what they're doing, and we'll see whether that actually does continue or not. So it is a trial process at the moment.
I wonder if I could ask other members of the committee to perhaps comment on what they see as the pros and cons of having an investment committee made up of the whole board. Michael?
I think there are different structures, and each fund has to decide what they're comfortable with. I could talk for Q Super. We have 11 5-hour meetings a year, and I think it was the weight of debate and substance of the issues that they made a decision that it was too much for the trustees to handle. And importantly, the majority of the members of the investment committee are still trustees, and so they have a process where there will be turnover occasionally of trustees, and there's always one trustee who is new and in a learning phase. But any recommendations that are made that then go back to the trustee meeting the following week, because you've got 5 trustees that were on the investment committee, there's a continuity.
So is there a sense of a second look, a sense of a kind of governance oversight through that two-step process?
Yeah, I think the main advantage of the investment committee is it can look at things in more detail and more things that a trustee board would not normally have the time to do. Certainly when I was chair, I was able to help the CIO set the agendas, and we were able to have things put on the meeting that a trustee board might be too busy to look at that point of time. So we did look at strategic issues. We'd look at asset allocation. Should we be changing it? As my super came along, is the balance fund the right default vehicle, or does it need changing? Now, boards would look at that as well, but the board can give us some specific briefs to review, debate, and I think it just gives them another perspective.
You wouldn't be allowed to be the chair under the new regulations, is that right?
Yeah, I had to step down because of the stronger super guidelines, and I think there were 2 or 3 other people in the community that were in the same boat.
There was a question a bit earlier on about SPS 220 and 530, and I think the question was whether it was a compliance ticker box or not. And this is really a really big issue, right? Because what we're talking about here is a regulator, through the prudential standards, recognising the trustee board's role and the importance of the trustee board's role, and the need for the board to be able to have the ability to be involved in the investments and actually talk about a ticker box process. But it really does come down to the fact of what you actually have to provide to the board and what the board is responsible for. And I think, Sue, we talked a little bit earlier about, is it just the investment committee that we are writing papers for, John, Danielle and our teams, or is it a wider group? And I think as a group here today, we need to think about the fact that as we move forward, these prudential standards are basically telling us what we must have in place to become defendable going forward. And I think at some point, we will have the regulators, but we will also have the courts, and we will have other people who will be reviewing this process and the way that we are operating as a group and as a board. And the SPS 220 and 530 puts the premises of the responsibility sitting right at the board. And the investment committee is almost like a tool for the board to utilise. And I guess the question really then becomes, what is the right committee membership for that investment team? And I think that's something I think we're all grappling with at the moment.
And I think it depends from fund to fund. I mean, it's very hard to say one model when someone was asking there about the key components of ideal framework. I think it depends, and I know that's a really wishy-washy answer and probably doesn't help anybody. But at the end of the day, if you've got a structure where you have a very strong investment team with internal investments, which is the model that Equip Super has, then the role of the investment committee is quite different to the role of the investment committee if you've got an investment team that is more a team of executors, where the decision is coming down. So I completely agree that the board is at the top of is the pinnacle of the triangle, and it has to be in governance, and certainly that's the law and the regulation. I think the regulations are there. You can certainly tick the box. It's pretty easy to tick the box. I don't think that's the intent of the regs, and I think we should be trying to go to the intent of the regulation, which is really about, as I read them, about really understanding risk and managing risk as well as return, because we look and focus so much on return. The super ratings, the Chantworth standards, even the APRA reporting is pushing us into returns. But the question that I think an investment committee should be asking, and the question that our members want our investment committee to be asking, is what risk are you taking to get that return? And I don't think we do that enough, and I think the regs are trying to push us there.
I agree. John?
Yeah, I completely agree with Danielle. I think risk is the missing component of deliberation. And I wanted to draw attention to another aspect of committees. I don't have a strong opinion on how many people should sit on the committee. Obviously it should be more than one and less than 1,000. But in terms of the constituent members, it seems to me you're going to have people who are very good at interrogating. You want to have people who are very good at making decisions, but you may find out that some people are not good at making decisions. And perhaps a model for us is the courtroom. So for reasons I have no way to answer, there are 12 members of a jury. So maybe folklore has decided 12 is the right number. But we also have barristers whose job is to pick apart witnesses when they give testimony. So clearly they are good interrogators, that's what they're trained to do, a bit like attack dogs. But are members of a jury good decision makers? I would say not at all. Why would 12 people chosen, well, to say randomly is a naive view of the legal system, chosen with some moulding and shaping, why would they be good decision makers if they've never had any background in making decisions, particularly on, in our world, financial matters?
Michael?
Look, perhaps the best way to put this is, if you didn't have an investment committee, what do you do when your asset consultant or your CIO tells you that you want to do something? It might be about currency hedging, it might be about scrip lending, complex issues, and most trustees are not investment experts. The background is that they will have done some other things, and investments is a very difficult issue. So the value of the investment committee is that they can debate these issues, and it's all minuted, of course, in front of a majority of trustees who can ask questions informally. It's not a board meeting. You can think about the implications of the decisions you make from a member's perspective, from the fund's perspective, and come to some sort of consensus. And remember, the investment committee is not actually making the decision on strategy, that is the board, but they do give some useful feedback about the pros and cons of making a decision, and then I think the board is in a stronger position. If you rely entirely on an asset consultant, do you really have the knowledge to challenge their view of the world? And it's not always right.
That, I guess, brings up the whole role of the CIO, the internal investment team, and their role in the investment committee deliberations vis-a-vis the consultants and sometimes even the asset managers. I wonder if anyone would like to comment on the respective roles as they see in an ideal framework. Our CIO,
I'll
perhaps,
have a
the
crack,
CEO.
and I'm sure that John will correct me where I'm wrong. I think the CIO has an extraordinarily important role within the investment committee in the way that the investment committee deliberates, in that he is the expert or she is the expert in the room. To go to John's example earlier of I bought a PC and I was sold it, I didn't buy it. I think it's actually the CIO's responsibility to make sure the investment committee is buying the decision and not being sold the decision. They should be challenging the investment and the asset consultants. They should be challenging the asset managers when they're in the room, because they are the conscience or that voice of expert that's in the room. But that said, they need to be able to explain it in terms that the people who are not investment experts actually understand it. And if they can't do that, then maybe it's too complex, or maybe they don't really understand it enough themselves, and we need to take a step back and say, should we be investing in it? Was a question there earlier about levels of delegation, and I think that all rolls up into it as well. What the role of the CIO is will depend on what the level of delegation is to the investment committee from the board, and then from the investment committee down to the CIOs. Some people the CIOs have the ability to choose asset managers, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have the ability to move their asset allocation within ranges, sometimes they don't. One model is not right, one model is not wrong, but it will depend on their role. And I think what's really important with an investment committee is that delegation is really clear. So the boards need to make up their mind what they want the investment committee to do and what they want the investment teams to do, and make sure that delegation is clear, that the authority is clear, and that the reporting and the accountability is clear as well, so that you can't have your CIO going, but I couldn't make that decision because the investment committee didn't let me. when you think, well, hang on, you were completely empowered to make the decision, why didn't you do it?
So that goes to a really clear committee charter and a very clear delegations document.
And a very clear governance principle and investment strategy manual.
John?
Sorry, John.
I'd like, again, to pick up on Danielle's point. As we move forward, rather than looking backwards, I think risk-based decision-making is going to be the absolute essence of everything we do. And in that important regard, I have the tagline that returns are public but risk is private. So what I mean is that a committee with the executive working with it has its own private opinions on risk. The consultant can and will contribute, and consultants are excellent people, but they are sort of universalists. They're dealing with lots of clients, and obviously their business model suits that and is built that way. But risk is private, and I think the job of the executive is to help the investment committee to develop and grow its assessment of risk in the world of investments.
That I think goes to your question too of whether we properly focus on risk-adjusted returns, and maybe that's what we should be focusing on privately. I'm going to go to the room in a moment, so if there are any questions that any of you wish to ask, but there's a brilliant one that's just been sent in. What process should we use to review the quality of investment committee decision-making? Anyone care to have a go at that?
Well,
So one of the things that we're actually setting up at the moment is really looking at decision making that's been done over the past little while by the investment committee / board and/or board, and sometimes it'll happen at both levels, and actually be able to see what the impact is, and through the attribution analysis and so forth that comes through as to how that decision making has impacted on the performance of the fund and on how we can improve that process. And I think that's an important part of the process of the governance structure, is to be able to recognise that once you've made the decisions, how has that impacted the performance of the fund, the risk and the risk of the particular business, because I agree risk is going to be a very important part of this process. And so those are the things that we're going to look at to try and see if we can set up the quality of the investment committee decisions or the board decisions. But it's also about ensuring that we have all of that decision-making process, but also being able to report that through the investment committee and board in a very sensible process. And one of the things that we've struggled with, and I'd be interested to see what the panel also has, is how do we actually bring all of that, SPS 530, 220, bring it all into a framework, into a process, and at the end of the day provide meaningful reports to committees and boards which they can then utilise to make decisions going forward. And I think that's the thing that we're all struggling with at the moment, is how do we get this reporting to a level that's appropriate and accurate and can be used to review past decisions and also to review and how we make the decisions going forward. So maybe Michael, you might give us some thoughts on
a lot
that
of
one.
it comes back to the delegations and the functions that you want the committee and the CIO to have. So, for example, at Q Super, all manager selection and review is done by the CIO and the internal investment team, because that's arguably not a strategic role. The investment committee, I think, is to guide the trustees on strategy, and that's broad because it means what's happening in the marketplace, even though you shouldn't be concerned with peers in terms of investment returns. You should be aware of what's happening in the market and make sure your fund is
So how do you know that the executive team, when they've moved managers around, has actually been the right decision to make?
Well, that's between them and the board.
So between the board.
It's not really a function of the investment committee, in my opinion.
So John, how do you report that up through?
Well, I think it's the right question, and the answer, I think, is through measurement. So you have to go back and measure the outcome of your decisions. And I'm reminded a long time ago when I used to hang around with people on trading desks at investment banks, and I would advise people to avoid that if they can. When you ask a trader, a principal trader, how's it going this month? The answer is always, I'm up. In other words, like all of us, they lack the ability of self-introspection that says, oh, I made a terrible decision, I must do something about it. It's human nature. So
I'm up, but we're all up.
We're all up. And so to Robyn's point, I think it's all about scrupulous measurement. We made this decision, let's now measure the impact, and if it didn't work out, okay, what do we do next?
I think we also measure what the decisions that we don't make, because not making a decision is inherently making a decision. I think sometimes we don't make decisions because they're too hard, and that can have consequences that we don't measure at all.
And sometimes, going back to John's very original point about regret, we've made a decision in the past that's had a poor outcome and we're too frightened to make it again.
But I think just on measurement, we're doing a significant amount of work at the moment around risk models and risk systems as well, so that you can actually measure risk, which is, for all the asset managers out there, you all know how complicated it is. You can buy one off the shelf, but it's not necessarily going to work. You can build it yourself, but that's going to take an awful lot of time, effort and energy, and they're very hard and sophisticated to do. So, I would encourage people to start looking at risk models. I think they help you. They will not keep you out of trouble, but at least you know where your risk is. And, we're in the business of taking risk, as everybody in this room knows. But you have to know what that risk is and are you being compensated for it. And I think that's really hard to know unless you've got some kind of measurement and some kind of system.
I don't see any raised hands, so I'm going to go to some of the questions on the screen. This might be a question to you, John, initially. Should the CIO influence the consultant papers and recommendations?
I think the executive and the consultants should work together. They should formulate a joint proposition. And yes, there can be disagreement, and in fact, disagreement is healthy, but it shouldn't be antagonism. It shouldn't be one says up, the other says down. It should be we both agree up, but we have some differences, and those differences would be the form of a discussion for trustees.
If it's a joint paper, how can the investment committee or the board see evidence of the checks and balances?
I would say that comes out in the interrogation process. So again, going back to my model of the courtroom, yes, trustees should be wearing those funny wigs, asking lots of hard questions.
There's a question that's exactly on that subject. Our representative model of trustees is like a jury for a good reason. Do we want our juries made up of lawyers or judges? Who wants to have a go?
Well, I think that's a really good question, right? Because the reason why we have a jury is to move away from the lawyers and judges and to get a different viewpoint through the process. The lawyers and judges' role is to provide the evidence for a jury who is meant to be of sound and good judgment making process, and that's what we're talking about here. Investments is an art, not a science. I mean, you're not going to get 2 + 2 = 4. You'll probably have multiple answers, and I guess it comes down to judgments. And I guess we talked about the investment committees versus the board and versus many areas, but at the end of the day, it's about getting to a point where you can make an accurate judgment. And so, it comes back again to about the size of the investment committee and the ability to do that. We talked about 12, we talked about various levels, but it really comes down to can the investment committee, is it big enough to stop the various biases that we all know when we talk about board composition? 1 or 2 being dominating the discussion, or is it if we've got too many, that means we're not going to meet on a regular basis because there's just too many to get into a room, and then we've got to move down into groupthink. And I think that's what the jury system is trying to achieve, is to actually stop the judges and the lawyers in there, and we all deal with these people and we know that they can have their own biases, and we've tried to cut those biases as much as we can, so at the end of the day the judgment that we do make is a good one.
And I think the comment from the floor goes to exactly that the role of the trustees on the investment committee is much broader than investments. It's business risk, it's reputational risk, it's peer risk. So another point well made. Sorry, I think I spoke over someone. No. Very quick question to all 4 of you. No details required. Just a simple yes or no. Has your board or investment committee ever made an investment decision without the support of your asset consultant? Robyn.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
There you are. So whoever that questioner was has now got, and there's a question from the back of the room. Yes.
Thanks very much for your thoughts, Danielle and John in particular. I was just thinking, Danielle, about what you were saying earlier in relation to not making decisions and, measuring. I'm here.
Yeah, it's found you.
And measuring those. And I wondered whether, because maybe not investing in something, that's a decision in itself.
Yes.
And I think there were a number of funds that came out of the GFC maybe not having the exposure that others did, and those decisions were critical to returns. I wonder, is there a fund, or are there funds that measure those decisions? Do all of the funds on the panel measure those decisions in some way? And just be interesting to hear about how you attribute that, I guess.
I have to say, I'd be the first person to say if there is someone in the audience that has worked out how to measure not making a decision, can I talk to you afterwards? Because I haven't quite, I don't know is the answer. I know that we have to do it, and I know that we have to consider the decisions that we don't make as well as the decisions that we do. But in any attribution analysis, that's extremely hard. I think you can certainly make some stab at it, which is what we do by saying, okay, let's take a what-if analysis and say, if we were invested in these assets, what would that have looked like? And run it through our attribution models, but that's not a perfect decision either.
No, I guess, but what you're saying maybe goes to what John was saying about likely outcomes.
Yeah.
You can't know exactly, but you can know roughly what you missed out on being hit for. Or
That's right. So we run it through our attribution model on what would it have looked like had we invested in these asset classes or this asset in this way, or not made the decision that we made. So we've made a decision to take 5% out of equities. What did that actually look like? We can work that out. What would have looked like had we stayed where we were before we made that decision? So we do that comparison. It's not perfect. And as I said, if anyone's got a perfect model, I'd be delighted to talk to you about it, because I think it's a really hard area of what we do. But it's something we need to get better at.
And also, let's not forget, we don't live in a frictionless world. So changes tend to cost money because you have to move from bid to offer, bid-ask spread. Change tends to have an operational impact on the fund that has a cost associated to it, maybe people doing work that they otherwise wouldn't. And I think one of the hardest decisions is to sit on your hands. So this was famously put by the Russian Field Marshal Kutuzov, who beat Napoleon in 1812. He said, when in doubt, do nothing. Now, that goes against everything we know as professionals. We're supposed to be busy, dynamic, doing things all day long. But I think old Kutuzov might have made quite a good trustee from time to time.
I'd just like to ask Michael a question, if I can, about the role of the chair in all of these deliberations, and what I guess the fine art of chairing all of the processes, the ensuring that the information is available, that sufficient time is provided. If you have any reflections on your role as a chair and what makes a good chair of an investment committee.
Yeah, the most difficult job as chair is to not dominate and give your opinion on everything. You really need to be a facilitator and make sure everybody is heard. I found my most useful contribution was sitting with Brad Holzberger and setting the agenda for each meeting, working out what the priorities were, trying to decide what needed to be in the papers that would be presented to the investment committee, and having a timetable. And that, and as an independent, you can also put your tuppence in and say, I wouldn't mind a discussion on the following topic. And so bring forward things that the trustees themselves might not have thought about.
Are there particular attributes or characteristics that independent directors bring?
Yes, they should be picked for their investment skills, and of course investment is such a broad area that they'll have. There might be a fund manager, there might be a consultant in that area, they might just run an SMSF and be an investor themselves. But what the gap you're looking for is that the trustees generally, while they learn about investments as part of their role, they don't start off as a trustee being an investment expert, and they'll never have the same level of expertise as an asset consultant. But so you're looking to the independents to be on your team and to help you go through these complex issues through your lens. Your asset consultant is certainly engaged to help you, but they help a lot of funds. They're not really on your side.
Can I just ask whether there are any more questions from the room for the panel before we might do one brief summing up? Yes, there's someone. Oh, there's numerous people.
Hello there. Gary Clifford, Foreign Emergency Services Super. I heard a lot of mention of experts on investment panels. I've noticed the world's full of experts. Frequently they're wrong, and so that's what I've noticed over time. I also heard mention of the role of a jury, and a jury isn't an expert panel. But one of the attributes of a jury is there's not people tripping over their own egos. And so they're greater lateral thinkers. They may not be well informed, but if they're there with goodwill, I think sometimes you can achieve much more effect. You're much more effective, the fact that you're there to try and do a job and do it well. I can understand investment committees for large funds, ours is a smaller fund, and so the whole board is the investment committee. But I think one of the greatest attributes of particular members of an investment committee is not experts per se, but good lateral thinkers. People who don't go in with a set position, listen to an asset consultant very, very carefully and weigh up what they hear, but then let it sit. And I can't say I get it right all the time. I get it right.
Okay,
some
I
of the time.
think we've got the gist of that question. So, integrity, common sense, goodwill as attributes of members of investment committees. Would anyone disagree?
No.
No.